Previously on Frugal Off-Grid, I was replacing the seal and gasket on my extension housing for the transmission.
Come here, buddy.
And making some welds for structural integrity of the trailer, which allowed me to make a run to pick up hay for the animals and a load of lumber for the cabin. It won't be long before I build a pole barn for the hay and possibly a tack room for the horses. Until then, I back up to a tree and strap my come along onto the tree, and I put a strap around the hay to make sure that it doesn't fall apart when I move it, and I just use the come along and then reset the come along until I can pull the hay completely out of the trailer. Normally I do this immediately upon getting back to the homestead, but it was a 9-hour day just to get the hay and lumber, and I was completely beat by the time I got back home, especially when I realized that the gasket they sent me was the wrong gasket, and I customized it to work to the best of my ability, but it's leaking, so I'll have to do that again. And I was just beat at the end of the day, and so I'm pulling the hay out now, and then I'll pull the trailer around and get to work on the cabin. I was able to get a pretty good deal on a large portion of my lumber because I was happy to take the less desirable lumber, which to me is still perfectly good lumber. I think it helps to imagine if you were to cut this lumber yourself in the middle of nowhere to build your cabin, would you even be able to make lumber so nice in the first place? And well, the answer for me would probably be no. I just don't have a lot of great trees around, and to me the lumber looks fine. I like the imperfections and the details of all the color and whatnot. And what I'll do is as I unload them, I'll use boards that are good enough, and when I find boards that are really perfect, I'll stack those and set them aside for rafters, and then any that are really messed up, I'll stack them on the end, and I'll just cut those ones up for blocks and whatnot. As I pulled boards out, I used boards that were good enough, and then I piled up other boards, and I've got a few wonky boards on the end. If you've been following along, you might know that I'm going to build my own stone fireplace, and to do that properly, you need to pour a foundation at ground level and build it on that. So I put in some posts 2 feet deep and another beam to support the floor, and that way I'll have a very structurally sound fireplace. Standard insulation is pretty great for residential homes and very common, and even the solid foam board can be pretty good. The problem with those insulations, living in the wilderness like I do, is pests like to house in them, and I decided to go with reflectix, which there's a lot of controversy all over the internet about how good the R value is and whatnot, and it's mostly because people don't install it correctly most of the time. But my camper van, an example, has reflectix wrapped on the ceiling and the floor, not installed correctly, and I've lived in it for 5 years in 20-degree temperatures, and it works very well. That being said, being careful to install the reflectix so that there's no air gaps along the bottom of my joists, and then again on the top of my joists, creates an 8-inch gap between the 2 layers, which significantly increases the R value. But the truth is the thermal values of the reflectix alone are more than enough to make them an outstanding insulation. It's waterproof, pest resistant, fire resistant. You know, the mice are just not going to bother it, and it'll do a very good job of insulating my cabin. And what it really shines at is in the roof. When the sun is beating down, it will actually reflect that thermal energy and bounce that hot energy away from the cabin, helping it maintain a more cool temperature. And it does that on the inside as well. So when I have a fire going, instead of the heat seeping through the floor joists, it will actually be bounced back into the middle of the cabin, making it much more comfortable inside. So the floor of my cabin will be the absolute most insulated part of the cabin because of that 8-inch gap. And then everything inside the cabin, I want you to be able to see the woodwork. And so all insulation will actually be on the outside of the building. Because of this, I won't be able to wrap the rafters the same way. But what I will do is I'll lay down slats before I put the roofing on, and that'll give me about a 1/2 inch or 1 inch gap, and that alone will increase the R value. And it'll be the same way on the siding. So there will be reflectix and then a gap, and that will improve the insulation abilities of the reflectix. So at this point, all the footings are done, all the joist hangers are put in, all the bolts are tied down tightly. Everything on the inside of the cabin area for the joists is complete, so I can insulate now, put insulation on the top, so I'm sandwiching the floor joists all together, and then I can start to cover the joists with flooring. I'm kind of piecing things together, but because it was windy, I wanted to cover the reflectix to make sure it didn't blow away. So this is how far I got yesterday, and I'll keep plugging away. Hopefully you'll subscribe to learn more about my channel, and check out my website.